Welcome to Classic Storytime Hub. Tonight, we descend into shadows with H.P. Lovecraft's chilling tale, The Rats in the Walls. This version has been carefully reimagined and rewritten in English, crafted to heighten suspense and bring fresh life to the classic horror. July 16th, 1923. The day I crossed the threshold of Exham Priory, the last hammer's echo still lingering in the air. What stood before me was no mere restoration, it was a resurrection. From a hollow ruin, little more than a skeletal shell, the ancestral seed of my bloodline had risen again, stone by stone, at a cost I dared not count. For this place was not simply a house, it was the cradle of my lineage, and I would see it reborn, no matter the price. Yet the priory carried shadows older than its walls. Since the reign of James I, it had stood abandoned, cursed by a tragedy so grotesque that whispers of it still poisoned the air. A master slain, 5 children silenced, servants struck down, and one lone heir, my forebear, fleeing beneath a storm of suspicion. Condemned as a murderer, he never sought to clear his name. Instead, Walter Delapore, the 11th Baron, turned his back on the edifice, fleeing across the ocean to Virginia, desperate to erase the site of Exham from memory. From his exile, the Delapore line was born. The priory itself remained untouched, claimed by the Norris estate, yet never truly inhabited. Scholars came to marvel at its strange anatomy, Gothic towers perched upon Saxon bones, Roman arches fused with something older still, whispers of Druidic stone and Cymric legend. Its foundations clung to the limestone cliff, gazing down upon a barren valley west of Anchester. Antiquarians adored its mystery, but the villagers loathed it. They had loathed it for centuries when my ancestors walked its halls, and they loathed it now, moss and decay draped across its carcass. I had scarcely set foot in Anchester before I felt the weight of their hatred, the certainty that I belonged to a damned house. And now, as I speak, the workmen have returned, not to restore, but to obliterate. Exham Priory lies in ruins once more, its foundations shattered, its memory buried beneath dust and stone. Yet the echoes remain, and the rats still stir in the walls of my mind. I had always known the bare outlines of my ancestry, the cold statistics, the whispered fact that my first American forebear crossed the ocean beneath a cloud of suspicion. Yet the details remained hidden, locked away by the deliberate silence of the Delapores. Unlike our neighbors, we never boasted of crusaders or Renaissance heroes. No tales of glory passed down through generations, only a sealed envelope, left by each patriarch before the Civil War to be opened by his eldest son after death. Whatever secrets it contained, they were lost to us. The pride we carried was not medieval, but Virginian, the honor of a stern, reserved line that flourished only after exile. That fragile pride was shattered in the flames of war. Carfax, our ancestral home on the banks of the James, was consumed by fire. I was 7 when I watched it burn. Federal soldiers shouting, women screaming, voices rising in prayer and terror. My grandfather perished in the blaze, and with him the envelope that bound us to our past. My father fought in Richmond, while my mother and I were driven north when the war ended. There, in the grayness of Massachusetts, I grew into manhood, wealth, and a life stripped of mystery. Neither my father nor I ever learned what secrets our family had buried. Had I known their nature, I would have gladly left Exham Priory to its bats and cobwebs. My father died in 1904, leaving no message for me, or for Alfred, my only child, then a motherless boy of 10.
It was Alfred who reversed the silence. When the Great War carried him to England as an aviation officer, he wrote to me of strange legends surrounding our name. The Delapores, it seemed, had a history far darker than I had imagined. His comrade, Captain Edward Norris of the Royal Flying Corps, lived near Anchester, close to the ruins of our ancestral seat. From him Alfred heard tales so wild, so grotesque, that even the most fevered novelist would hesitate to invent them. And thus, through my son, the shadows of our past began to stir once more. Captain Norris himself dismissed the old tales as harmless superstition, yet they delighted my son and filled his letters with strange color. It was those legends that first stirred my curiosity about our transatlantic heritage and planted the resolve to reclaim and restore the ancestral seat. Norris had shown Alfred the priory in its lonely ruin, and even offered to secure it for me at a price so modest it seemed almost uncanny, his uncle being the current owner. I purchased Exham Priory in 1918, but fate intervened. My son returned from the war broken, a maimed invalid, and for 2 years my life was consumed entirely by his care. Business was handed to partners, and every thought bent toward him. When death claimed him in 1921, I was left bereft, purposeless, a retired man with years still to endure. It was then I turned to the priory, seeking in its stones a diversion for my grief.
That December, I journeyed to Anchester, where Captain Norris, plump, genial, and fond of my son, welcomed me warmly. With his help, I gathered plans and stories to guide the restoration. The priory itself I beheld without sentiment, a skeletal jumble of medieval ruins, lichens clinging to crumbling walls, rooks nesting in hollow towers, the whole structure clinging precariously to the edge of a cliff. Floors were gone, interiors stripped bare, only the stark stone shells of towers remained, silent and accusing. Piece by piece, I began to imagine the edifice as it had stood 3 centuries before, and so I summoned workmen to rebuild. Yet none could be found among the villagers. The people of Anchester recoiled from the place with a hatred so deep it bordered on madness. Even outsiders, once exposed to their whispers, abandoned the work in fear. The loathing extended not only to the priory, but to the family itself. My son had told me he was shunned for bearing the name Delapore, and now I too felt the sting of quiet ostracism. Only when I convinced them of my ignorance of our heritage did they tolerate me, though never warmly. Through Norris I gathered their traditions, for they would not speak to me directly. What they could not forgive, perhaps, was my intent. To them, Exham Priory was no mere ruin, but a blasphemous symbol, a haunt of fiends and werewolves, and by restoring it, I was breathing life into a nightmare they longed to see buried forever. From the fragments Norris gathered, and the accounts of scholars who had studied the ruins, a dreadful picture began to form. Exham Priory, it seemed, was no ordinary medieval relic. It stood upon the bones of something far older. A temple, prehistoric, perhaps druidical, raised in the same age as Stonehenge. Few doubted that rites beyond description had been enacted there, and darker whispers claimed those rites were carried forward into the worship of Cybele, the Magna Mater, whose cult the Romans themselves had once forbidden. In the subcellar, inscriptions still scar the stone, letters half erased yet unmistakable. Div, Ops, Magna, Mat, a silent echo of ceremonies that should never have been remembered. Anchester, long ago, was the camp of Rome's 3rd Augustan Legion.
The temple of Cybele was said to have been magnificent, thronged with worshippers who obeyed the commands of a Phrygian priest. Yet when the old religion fell, the rites did not die. The priests, it was whispered, merely changed their robes, carrying their orgies into the new faith without pause. Even the Saxons, centuries later, built upon the remnants, shaping the outline that endured, and turning the place into the heart of a cult feared across half of the Heptarchy.
By the year 1000, chronicles spoke of a stone priory, its gardens sprawling, its monastic order powerful and strange. The people needed no walls to keep them out. Their fear alone was barrier enough. The Danes never destroyed it, but after the Norman conquest, its power waned. Thus, when Henry III granted the site to Gilbert Delapore, first Baron Exham in 1261, nothing stood in his way. Before that date, my family's name bore no stain. But something changed. A chronicle of 1307 speaks of a Delapore cursed of God. Village legends, passed in hushed tones by the fire, told only of horror. Grim tales, so vague, so evasive, that their very silence was more terrifying than words. My ancestors were painted as a race of hereditary demons, monsters beside whom Gilles de Rat and the Marquis de Sade would seem mere apprentices. And always whispered in dread was the suggestion that they were responsible for the disappearances of villagers, vanishings that spanned generations. The darkest whispers always clung to the barons and their heirs. If one showed signs of health or virtue, fate, or something more sinister would strike him down, clearing the path for a successor more suited to the family's dreadful legacy. Beneath the surface, there seemed to exist a hidden cult, presided over by the head of the house, its circle closed to all but a chosen few. Blood was not the only key, temperament was. Outsiders who married into the line sometimes found themselves drawn into its shadow. Lady Margaret Trevor of Cornwall, wife to Godfrey, second son of the 5th Baron, became infamous as a terror to children across the countryside. Immortalized in a ghastly ballad still sung near the Welsh border. Another tale, preserved in song, though of a different nature, told of Lady Mary Delapore, slain by her husband, the Earl of Shrewsfield, and his mother. Both killers were absolved by the priest to whom they confessed, though what they revealed was never spoken aloud to the world. These legends, crude and superstitious as they were, repelled me. Their persistence, stretching across centuries of my bloodline, was maddening. Worse still, they echoed the one scandal I knew from my immediate family. My cousin, Randolph Delapore of Carfax, who, after the Mexican War, abandoned all decency, mingled with slaves, and returned as a voodoo priest. The vaguer tales disturbed me less. Stories of whales drifting through the windswept valley beneath the limestone cliff, of graveyard stench rising after spring rains, of a pale, squealing thing crushed under Sir John Clave's horse in a lonely field, or of a servant driven mad by what he saw in the priory under full daylight. These were the common currency of ghost lore, and at that time I was a skeptic. More troubling were the accounts of vanished peasants, though even those seemed less remarkable when weighed against medieval custom. Curiosity was often fatal, and more than one severed head had once been displayed upon the bastions of Exham Priory, long since effaced but never forgotten. Some of the legends were so vivid, so grotesquely picturesque, that I often wished I had studied mythology more deeply in my youth. One tale spoke of a legion of bat-winged devils gathering each night within the priory to hold their witches' sabbath, a legion whose unnatural feasts were said to explain the monstrous yield of coarse vegetables in the gardens. But most haunting of all was the epic of the rats. 3 months after the tragedy that condemned the castle to ruin, they came. A ravenous horde, lean and filthy, pouring from the walls in a frenzy. They swept across the land like a living plague, devouring everything in their path. Fowl, cats, dogs, hogs, sheep, even 2 unfortunate souls who could not escape their fury. That unforgettable army of vermin spawned its own cycle of myths, for it scattered into village homes, leaving curses and horrors in its wake. Such was the lore that surrounded me as I pressed forward, stubbornly, with the restoration of my ancestral home. Yet these tales did not dominate my mind. On the contrary, I was buoyed by the encouragement of Captain Norris and the antiquarians who aided me. And when, after more than 2 years, the work was complete, I stood within the great rooms, beneath vaulted ceilings, beside wainscoted walls, gazing through mullioned windows, and felt a pride that outweighed the immense cost. Every detail of the Middle Ages had been reborn, seamlessly blended with the original foundations. The seat of my fathers was whole again, and I resolved to redeem my family name. I would live here, prove that a Delapore need not be a fiend. My comfort was strengthened by the knowledge that, though the priory looked medieval, its interior was new, untouched by vermin, untainted by ghosts. And so, on July 16th, 1923, I moved in. My household was modest, 7 servants and 9 cats, creatures I have always cherished. My eldest, Negan Man, had been with me for 7 years, brought from my home in Bolton, Massachusetts. The others I had gathered during my stay with Captain Norris's family, while the priory was being restored. Together we crossed the threshold of Exham Priory, unaware of the shadows that still lingered in its walls.
For 5 days, life within Exham Priory unfolded with deceptive calm. My hours were spent cataloging fragments of family history, and in that work I uncovered chilling accounts of Walter Delapore's final days in England. It seemed certain that these were the very secrets once sealed in the hereditary paper lost to the flames at Carfax. The story was stark. Walter had slain nearly his entire household, his father, 3 brothers, 2 sisters, leaving alive only 4 servants who aided him and fled with him into obscurity. The massacre came 2 weeks after some dreadful discovery, a revelation that transformed his gentle nature into something grim and unrecognizable. What he found, none could say. Perhaps he had stumbled upon some ancient rite, or uncovered a symbol too terrible to endure. Whatever it was, it drove him to purge his bloodline in a single night of slaughter. The villagers, strangely, did not condemn him. Whispered sentiment held that he had cleansed the land of a curse older than memory. The law treated him with astonishing leniency, and so he escaped openly to Virginia, where he lived not as a hardened criminal, but as a haunted man. In the diary of Francis Harley of Bellevue, Walter is described as a figure of rare justice and delicacy, yet always harassed, always apprehensive, as though shadows followed him across the sea. Then came July 22, the first incident. At the time it seemed trivial, hardly worth notice, but in hindsight it gleams with sinister significance. The house was new in all but its walls, the staff balanced and reliable, and fear would have seemed absurd. Yet my old black cat, a creature whose moods I know as well as my own, was restless beyond reason. He prowled from room to room, tail twitching, ears pricked,
sniffing constantly at the ancient Gothic stone. His unease was palpable, unnatural, and wholly out of character. I dismissed it then as superstition, the cliché of the ghost story's dog growling before the apparition appears. But I cannot suppress the memory now, for in that moment the priory had already begun to stir. The next day, a servant came to me with unease in his voice. He claimed that every cat in the house had grown restless, prowling as though disturbed by something unseen. As he spoke, I glanced toward the west wall of my study, a lofty chamber with groined arches, black oak panels, and a Gothic window that gazed out over the cliff and the desolate valley. There, I saw the shadowed form of N-Man, my oldest cat, creeping along the wall, claws scratching at the new panels that concealed the ancient stone beneath. I told the man it must be some subtle odor, some emanation from the old masonry, imperceptible to human senses, but keenly felt by the delicate organs of cats. When he suggested mice or rats, I dismissed it. No rats had infested these walls for 3 centuries, and even the field mice of the countryside had never strayed so high. Later that afternoon, Captain Norris confirmed my belief. It was unthinkable that mice could suddenly swarm the priory in such fashion. That night, as was my custom, I retired alone to the West Tower chamber I had claimed as my own. The room was circular, lofty, hung with arras I had chosen in London, its stone staircase and gallery leading up from the study. I closed the heavy Gothic door, the electric bulbs casting their clever imitation of candlelight, before extinguishing them and sinking into the carved 4-poster bed. N-Man lay across my feet, as he always did. I left the curtains open, gazing at the narrow north window where faint auroral light traced the delicate lattice of stone. At some point, sleep claimed me. I remember drifting from strange dreams when N-Man suddenly sprang to life. In the dim glow I saw him, rigid, forepaws pressed against my ankles, hind legs stretched behind, his head thrust forward in tense alertness. His gaze was fixed upon a spot on the wall west of the window. To my eyes there was nothing there, no mark, no shadow, but the cat's intensity was undeniable, and as I watched, I knew with chilling certainty N-Man was not excited in vain. Whether the tapestry truly stirred, I cannot say. Perhaps it shifted, just slightly. But what I can swear to is this: from behind it came a sound, low and distinct, the unmistakable scurrying of rats. In an instant, N-Man leapt, claws tearing into the arras, dragging it down in a heavy collapse. The ancient stone wall beneath was revealed, damp and patched by restorers, yet utterly bare of vermin. Still, the cat prowled frantically across the floor, clawing at the fallen fabric, even trying to wedge a paw between the wall and the oak boards. He found nothing. At last, exhausted, he returned to his place at my feet. I did not move, and though the night stretched on, I did not sleep again.
By morning I questioned the servants. None had noticed anything unusual, save the cook, who recalled a cat howling upon her windowsill. Awakened, she saw the creature dart through the open door and vanish down the stairs. I drifted through the noon hours in uneasy drowsiness, and later sought Captain Norris. He listened with keen interest, the odd incidents appealing to his taste for the picturesque. He shared with me tales of local ghost lore, and though we were baffled by the notion of rats, he lent me traps and Paris green, which I ordered the servants to place throughout the house. That evening, weary, I retired early. But sleep brought no peace. I dreamed of a cavern vast and foul, knee-deep in filth, where a white-bearded swineherd drove a herd of grotesque, flabby beasts. Their shapes filled me with loathing beyond words. Then, as the swineherd faltered, a storm of rats descended. An endless torrent, devouring beasts and master alike in a frenzy of gnashing teeth. I awoke with a start. Nigman was upon me, snarling, hissing, claws sunk deep into my ankle. And this time I needed no explanation. The chamber itself was alive, the walls crawling with sound, a nauseating chorus of slithering, ravenous rats. Gigantic, unseen, yet everywhere. The aurora was gone, the tapestry restored, but terror did not paralyze me. I reached for the switch, and the chamber flared with light. As the bulbs flared to life, the tapestry convulsed in a grotesque shudder, its strange designs writhing as though caught in a macabre dance of death. Then, suddenly as it began, the motion ceased, and with it, the sound. I sprang from the bed, seized the long handle of a warming pan, and prodded the arras, lifting a section to reveal only the patched stone wall beneath. Nothing stirred there. Even Nigman had lost his tense awareness of unseen presences. Yet, when I examined the trap set in the chamber, I found every opening sprung, though whatever had been caught had vanished without a trace. Sleep was impossible. Candle in hand, I opened the door and stepped into the gallery, the cat padding at my heels. Before we reached the stairs, he darted ahead, vanishing down the ancient flight. As I descended, a new sound rose from the great room below, sounds that could not be mistaken. The oak-paneled walls were alive, vibrating with the frenzy of rats. Nigman tore across the floor in a frenzy, a hunter maddened by prey he could not seize. I switched on the light, but this time the illumination did not silence them. The riot continued, a stampede so forceful, so distinct, that I could trace their movement. They were not wandering aimlessly, they were migrating. An endless horde pouring from unimaginable heights into depths equally inconceivable.
Then came footsteps in the corridor. 2 servants entered, pale and alarmed, searching for the source of a disturbance that had driven every cat in the house into a snarling panic. The creatures had plunged down staircases, yowling before the sealed door of the subcellar. I asked the men if they heard the rats. They had not, and when I turned to point out the noise in the panels, it was gone. Together we descended to the subcellar door, but the cats had already dispersed. Later, I resolved to explore the crypt beneath. For now, I made a round of the traps. All were sprung. All were empty. Alone in my study until dawn, I sat in heavy thought, piecing together every legend I had unearthed about the accursed building I now called home. I dozed through the late morning, slumped in the single comfortable chair my medieval furnishing scheme had not banished. By afternoon I summoned Captain Norris, and together we descended into the subcellar. Nothing unusual revealed itself, yet we could not suppress a thrill at the knowledge that these vaults were Roman, every arch, every pillar carved in the severe harmony of Caesar's age. The walls bore inscriptions long familiar to antiquarians, fragments like P. Getae, Prop, Temp, Dona, and El Praecis, Bus, Pontifex, Attius, etched deep into the stone. The name of Attis chilled me. I had read Catullus and knew of the grotesque rites of that Eastern god, rites entwined with the worship of Cybele. By lantern light, Norris and I examined the worn designs carved into rectangular blocks of stone, altars most believed. One pattern, a rayed sun, suggested origins older than Rome, hinting that the priests had adopted relics from some aboriginal temple long forgotten. On one block, brown stains lingered, stirring uneasy speculation. The largest altar, set in the center, bore marks that spoke of fire,
burnt offerings, perhaps, consumed in ceremonies best left unimagined. This was the crypt before whose door the cats had howled. Here, Norris and I resolved to spend the night. Servants carried down couches, instructed to ignore any nocturnal frenzy among the cats. N-Man was admitted, not merely for companionship, but for his uncanny vigilance. We sealed the great oak door, a modern replica, its slits allowing air, and settled in, lanterns burning, to await whatever might come. The vault lay deep within the foundations of the priory, carved into the limestone cliff that loomed over the desolate valley. I could not doubt that this was the destination of the scurrying rats, though their purpose remained a mystery. As I lay in uneasy expectation, my vigil blurred with half-formed dreams broken by the restless stirrings of the cat across my feet, his movements a silent warning that something unseen was stirring in the dark.
The dreams returned foul and familiar. Again I saw the twilight grotto, the swineherd driving his obscene fungus beasts through the mire. This time they seemed closer, sharper, so vivid I could almost discern their faces. And then I did. One flabby visage leered back at me, and I awoke with a scream so piercing that N-Man leapt in alarm, while Captain Norris, who had not slept, laughed at my terror. He might have laughed differently, more, or perhaps not at all, had he known what vision had clawed its way into my mind. But mercifully, horror often numbs memory, and I did not recall the full image until later. Norris roused me gently when the phenomena began. From the nightmare I was shaken into waking, urged to listen. And indeed, there was much to hear. Beyond the sealed door at the head of the stone steps came a cacophony, a nightmare chorus of feline shrieks and clawing. Outside, the cats howled in frenzy, while within, N-Man raced madly along the bare stone walls. And from those walls I heard it again, the babble of scurrying rats, the same verminous tumult that had plagued me the night before. A terror seized me, sharp and unrelenting. These were no ordinary sounds. If not the hallucinations of madness shared between myself and the cats, then the rats must be burrowing through Roman walls I had believed solid limestone. Perhaps water over 17 centuries had carved winding tunnels now widened by generations of gnawing bodies. Yet even if that were true, the horror remained. For if these were living vermin, why did Norris hear nothing? Why did he urge me to watch the cat, to listen to the cries outside, while guessing vaguely at causes he could not name? At last, I managed to explain what I thought I was hearing. Even as I spoke, the sound faded, retreating downward, far beneath this deepest of subcellars, until it seemed the entire cliff was riddled with questing rats. Norris listened, and to my surprise, he was not dismissive. He was moved, profoundly so, as though the unseen migration stirred something deep within him. Captain Norris motioned for me to notice. The cats at the door had fallen silent, their frenzy spent, as though conceding the rats to some unreachable abyss. Yet N-Man was seized by a fresh burst of agitation, clawing wildly at the base of the great stone altar in the center of the chamber, nearer Norris's couch than mine. My dread was immense. Something extraordinary had occurred, and I saw that Norris, stout, practical, and far less inclined to superstition, was shaken as deeply as I. Perhaps his lifelong familiarity with the local legends made the moment all the more terrible.
We could do nothing but watch the old black cat, his claws raking with diminishing strength. his eyes lifting toward me with that pleading look he used when he wished me to act. At last, Norris took up a lantern and knelt beside the altar, scraping away the lichens that bound the ancient block to the tessellated floor. He found nothing. He was about to abandon the effort when I noticed something trivial, yet dreadful. I pointed it out, and together we stared at the subtle sign with horrified fascination. The lantern flame, set near the altar, flickered faintly. A draught of air was rising from the crevice between floor and stone, a breath from some hidden space below. We spent the remainder of the night in the study, its lights blazing against the encroaching dark, debating our course. The revelation that a vault lay deeper than the deepest Roman masonry, unknown even to centuries of antiquarians, was enough to stir excitement without any sinister background. But here, with the weight of legend pressing upon us, the fascination was doubled. Should we abandon the search, flee the priory forever, and leave its secrets buried? Or should we yield to curiosity, brave the descent, and confront whatever horrors awaited in the depths? By morning, we had reached a compromise. We would go to London, gather archaeologists and men of science, and return with minds prepared to face the mystery. Before leaving the subcellar, we tried in vain to move the central altar. It would not budge. We knew then that it was no mere stone, but a sealed gateway, a threshold to a pit of nameless fear, and the secret of its opening would have to be left to wiser men than us. For many days in London, Captain Norris and I laid out our findings, our conjectures, our fragments of legend before 5 eminent authorities. These were men of reputation, scholars who could be trusted to treat any family disclosures with discretion. To our relief, they did not scoff. Instead, they listened with grave interest, their sympathy genuine. Among them was Sir William Brinton, famed for his excavations in the Troad, which had once stirred the world. When at last we boarded the train for Manchester, I felt myself balanced on the edge of dreadful revelation. The sensation was mirrored by the somber mood among Americans abroad, mourning the sudden death of their president across the sea.
On the evening of August 7th, we arrived at Exham Priory. The servants assured us that nothing unusual had occurred. The cats, even old N-Man, were calm, and not a single trap had been sprung. We would begin our exploration the following day. That night, I retired to my tower chamber, N-Man stretched across my feet. Sleep came swiftly, but dreams soon assailed me. I saw a Roman feast, grotesque in its splendor, with some horror concealed beneath a covered platter. Then came the recurring vision, the swineherd and his loathsome drove in the twilight grotto. Yet when I awoke, daylight streamed through the window, and the house below stirred with ordinary sounds. The rats, whether spectral or real, had not troubled me. N-Man lay quietly asleep. Elsewhere, tranquility reigned. One of the savants, Thornton, a man devoted to psychic speculation, suggested, rather absurdly, that I had now been shown what certain forces had wished me to see. By 11 a.m., all was prepared. Our group of 7 descended into the sub-cellar, bolting the heavy door behind us. Each man carried a powerful electric searchlight and tools for excavation. N-Man accompanied us, for none dismissed his excitability. Indeed, they welcomed his presence should obscure rodent manifestations arise. We gave only brief attention to the Roman inscriptions and the strange altar designs, for 3 of the scholars had already studied them. All focus turned instead to the central altar, the ominous monolith that had resisted us before. And within an hour, Sir William Brinton had caused it to tilt backward, balanced by some hidden counterweight of unknown design.
What lay revealed beneath the altar was a horror so profound that only our grim anticipation kept us from collapse. Through a square opening in the tiled floor stretched a flight of stone steps, worn so smooth by centuries that they sloped like an inclined plane. And upon those steps sprawled a ghastly litter of bones, human or nearly so. Skeletons lay twisted in attitudes of panic, their skulls betraying idiocy, deformity, and primitive ape-like features. Everywhere, the marks of gnawing teeth scarred the remains, as though vermin had feasted upon them in ages past. Above the grisly descent arced a passage, carved from solid rock, through which a current of air drifted. It was not the foul rush of a sealed tomb, but a cool, fresh breeze, as if from some hidden fissure in the cliff beyond. Shuddering, we began to clear a way down the steps. Sir William, examining the walls, made a chilling observation. The strokes of the chisels ran upward. The passage had been carved from beneath. I must choose my words carefully now, for as we pressed downward, bones crunching beneath our feet, a pale light glimmered ahead. Not the phosphorescence of decay, but filtered daylight, seeping through unseen cracks in the cliff that overlooked the desolate valley. That such fissures had escaped notice was no surprise. The valley was barren, and the cliff so sheer that only an aeronaut could have studied its face in detail. Then, with a few more steps, the sight struck us like a physical blow. Our breath was torn away. Thornton, the psychic investigator, collapsed in a faint. Norris, his plump face drained of color, cried out incoherently. I myself gasped, hissing, and covered my eyes. Behind me, the oldest of our company croaked the worn phrase, "My God," in a voice cracked with terror. Of 7 cultivated men, only Sir William Brinton retained his composure, an achievement all the more remarkable, for he had led the way and must have seen the vision first. We stood at the threshold of a twilight grotto, vast beyond imagination, its vaulted heights stretching into endless shadow. It was a subterranean world of mystery and dread, where fragments of forgotten civilizations lay scattered, tumuli arranged in strange patterns, a savage ring of monoliths, the crumbling dome of a Roman ruin, a sprawling Saxon structure, and the skeletal remains of an early English edifice of wood. Yet all these relics were dwarfed by the horror that covered the ground itself. For as far as the eye could see, the earth was carpeted with bones, human, or nearly so, strewn in a chaotic sea of white. Some lay shattered, others still clung together as skeletons frozen in grotesque postures of frenzy, clawing at unseen threats, grappling with one another in cannibal embrace. It was a vision of madness preserved in stone and dust. Dr. Trask, the anthropologist, bent to examine the skulls. His face paled. They were a degraded mixture, baffling in their variety. Most lay beneath even the Piltdown man in the scale of evolution, yet all were unmistakably human. Some showed higher development, and a few bore the marks of refined, sensitive intellect. But every skull was gnawed. Rats had feasted here, and not only rats. Among the remains were smaller bones, the fallen members of that verminous army which had once swept through this abyss. I marvel that any of us survived that day with sanity intact. No nightmare penned by Hoffman or Heismans could rival the grotesque spectacle of that grotto. Horror followed horror as we staggered forward, each revelation more appalling than the last. Thornton fainted again when Trask whispered that some of these creatures had descended into quadrupeds, generation after generation, 20 or more, until they crawled like beasts upon the earth.
The architecture told its own tale. The quadruped things, with their occasional biped recruits, had been kept in stone pens. In their final delirium of hunger or terror of the rats, they had broken free. Great herds had once been fattened here, nourished on coarse vegetables whose rotting remains still lay at the bottom of ancient stone bins older than Rome itself. And in that moment I understood why my ancestors had cultivated such vast gardens. Would to heaven I could forget. For the purpose of those herds was all too clear, and the truth was more monstrous than words could bear.
Sir William, his searchlight sweeping across the Roman ruin, read aloud the most appalling ritual I had ever heard. Rites of an antediluvian cult whose diet the priests of Cybele had adopted and mingled with their own. Norris, hardened though he was by the trenches, staggered when he emerged from the English building. He had expected a butcher's shop and kitchen, but not the sight of familiar English tools stained with such use, nor graffiti scrawled on the walls, some as recent as 1610. I could not bring myself to enter that place, the chamber whose demon practices had been ended only by the dagger of my ancestor, Walter Delapore. Instead, I ventured into the low Saxon structure. Its oaken door collapsed with age. Inside, a grim row of 10 stone cells stood with rusted bars. 3 still held tenants, skeletons of noble bearing, and on the finger of one I found a seal ring engraved with my own coat of arms. Sir William uncovered a deeper vault beneath the Roman chapel, lined with older cells, though these were empty. Below them lay a crypt where bones were arranged with dreadful formality, some inscribed with parallel texts in Latin, Greek, and the tongue of Phrygia. Meanwhile, Dr. Trask opened one of the prehistoric tumuli, revealing skulls scarcely more human than a gorilla's, carved with indecipherable ideographs. Through all this horror, my cat prowled undisturbed. Once I saw him perched monstrously atop a mountain of bones, his yellow eyes gleaming with secrets I dared not imagine. Having grasped, in part, the frightful revelations of this twilight domain, so hideously foreshadowed by my recurring dreams, we turned toward the boundless cavern beyond, a midnight abyss into which no light from the cliff could penetrate. We shall never know what sightless Stygian worlds yawned in those depths, for we agreed that such secrets were not meant for mankind. Yet even close at hand there was more than enough to appall us. Our searchlights revealed an endless array of pits, pits where the rats had feasted, pits whose sudden emptiness had driven the ravenous horde to madness. First they turned upon the living herds of starving things, and then, in their frenzy, they burst forth from the priory itself in that historic orgy of devastation which the peasants will never forget. God, those pits, black chasms filled with carrion bones, skulls split and hollowed, centuries of Celtic, Roman, Saxon, and English remains piled in obscene profusion. Some pits were brimming, others plunged bottomless into darkness, their depths unreachable even by our searchlights. I thought of the rats, hapless vermin tumbling into those traps during their endless quests through this Tartarus of death. And then my foot slipped near a yawning brink, and for a heartbeat I felt wild, ecstatic terror. I must have wandered in thought too long, for when I looked up, only Norris remained in sight, his plump figure pale against the abyss. Then it came, a sound from the boundless dark, a sound I knew too well.
My old black cat darted past me like a winged idol of Egypt, vanishing into the gulf. And I followed, for I knew the truth. The scurrying had returned. The eldritch, fiend-born rats, questing for horrors yet unseen, leading me deeper, deeper toward the caverns at Earth's core where Nyarlathotep, the faceless god, howls to the piping of idiot flutes. My searchlight died, but still I ran. Voices, echoes, yowls surrounded me, but above all rose that insidious scurrying, rising, rising like a bloated corpse drifting upward through a black river beneath endless bridges of onyx. Something struck me, soft, plump, obscene. The rats, I thought, the ravenous horde that devours both dead and living. Why should they not feast on a Delapore as a Delapore feasts on forbidden flesh? The war devoured my son. The Yanks burned Carfax and grandsire Delapore with his secret. No, I am not that demon swineherd in the grotto. It was not Norris's fat face upon that fungus beast. Who dares call me a Delapore? He lived, but my boy died. Shall a Norris hold the lands of my blood? Curse you, Thornton, fainting at the truth of my family. Blood, stinkard, I'll teach you. Magna Mater, Otis, Diadagahe and Arden, Donus and Dolus Ort, Ungle. That is what they claim I said when they found me. 3 hours later, in the blackness, found me crouched over the bloated, half-eaten body of Captain Norris, while my own cat leapt at my throat with a frenzy I cannot forget. They have destroyed Exham Priory now, blown it to rubble, and taken N-Man from me. They have locked me here in this barred room at Hanwell, whispering of heredity, of curses, of things they dare not put to paper. Thornton lies in the next cell, but they forbid me to speak with him. They are trying to bury the truth, to suppress the facts of what we uncovered beneath the priory. When I speak of poor Norris, they accuse me of an unspeakable crime. But they must know it was not I. It was the rats, the slithering, scurrying rats whose endless scampering will never let me rest. The demon rats that race behind the padded walls of this room, beckoning me downward, ever downward toward horrors greater than any I have yet endured. Rats they cannot hear. Rats they will never believe in. The rats in the walls.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.